Today we're going to be talking to a neurosurgeon, Jack Kruse. He's I think the smartest person that I've ever had the chance to talk to, and soon you will hear why. I'm pretty sure. The first question to Dr. Kruse, probably you have done it many times already, but let's force you once more. Tell us a little bit about yourself. You're a well-respected neurosurgeon. You save people's lives pretty much. You open their heads or back or whatever you do. And then all of a sudden you decide to start blogging about not just health, but you start blogging about quantum physics and medical physics and something that's really complicated, and it's not a safe road at all. Can you tell what made you do that?
Well, I mean, today, my day job, which, I think a lot of people are impressed at when you hear the term neurosurgery, it has a lot of, positive connotations for people. But for me, I consider that my hobby now. My real job is actually what I do on my website, my forum, and my blog. And the reason I say that is not to downgrade medicine. It's actually for people to understand that medicine is today filled with half-truths. And half-truths usually lead to full lies, especially when it comes to biology. And it's part of the reason why we can't solve, some of the Neolithic diseases that have exploded in the 20th century. So my story is pretty simple. About 10, 12 years ago, I was totally hell-bent into neurosurgery. And I was given a talk on minimally invasive spine surgery in Birmingham, Alabama, to a group of surgeons and several of their office personnel. When I stood up, I got a horrible pain in my right knee, and I could barely walk to the podium. And I had to have help. And I gave the talk, and I was miserable. And one of the doctor's wives, who happened to work for a biotechnology company here in the United States, said, "Look, I think I know why this happened to you, and I'd like to send you some information." After I got home, and she gave me specific instructions. A FedEx package showed up in my house, and it had a book that was a fable written by a gentleman named Robin Sharma called The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. And then there were 6 papers in there linked to a variety of different topics: light, some on water, and one specific one on leptin. And I realized fairly quickly after reading the book and several of the papers that she was trying to tell me that the reason I tore my knee meniscus is because I was overweight and obese, but not for the reasons that I was taught in medical school. And one thing led to another, and over a period of about 18 months, I went to the local medical school library where I was living, and I started to photostat papers that brought me down this rabbit hole. And I began to realize that biology wasn't a fundamental science. Actually, everything in biology is based on physics. And then when my world crashed into mitochondria, I started to realize that mitochondria don't have protein, lipid, and carbohydrate transporters in them. It's called electron chain transport. And I didn't know very much about electrons, and I knew even less about protons. And that's when my world really changed. And from those readings, I jumped down a rabbit hole that brought me fairly close to one of your neighbors in Russia. And I started to read a lot about light and how light interacts with electrons and how light interacts with protons. And I then took a trip to Europe, and I was standing behind a pretty famous statue in Florence, Italy, and everybody was in front of the statue admiring it, and I stood behind it, and I looked up at supposed perfection in Michelangelo's statue. Then I looked down at me and I said, "What's the thing that separates perfection from my fat ass?" Because at the time I was 6'2" and about 360 pounds. I don't know what that is in kilos, but I'm sure you guys can figure it out.
That's a lot, yeah.
But it was big. And then in that museum, a bright light from the sun came through the glass, and immediately I put it together. His environment was different than the environment that I was in. 500 years, tremendous things have changed. And And when I got that insight, I got back on the airplane from Charles de Gaulle over to Chicago, and I wrote my quilt document that basically put all these initial ideas down. And I went back to the library and started pulling more papers, because these papers led to more rabbit holes and more rabbit holes. And I realized when I jumped down this rabbit hole that I needed to know a lot more about physics than I did about biology. I already mastered biology, to become a neurosurgeon. So that was the easy part. I also wouldn't say I mastered chemistry, but I did very, very well in chemistry. You have to, in order to be a neurosurgeon, but it's not something that you actively use in the practice of neurosurgery full time. But it was pretty easy getting back on that bicycle, so to speak. Now, physics, especially the quantum physics, that was totally new ballgame, because outside of basic physics, you don't have to, in the United States, physicians do not need any serious physics classes to gain their medical degree. And physics is not used at all in medical education, either in medical school or in residency, with the exception of a few specialties, which are probably dermatology and ophthalmology. And what they truly understand about light, water, and magnetism, you could probably put in the thimble in terms of what you need to know. And when I finally got it all together, I used these principles on myself, never believing that they would work. And I realized that I could use light, water, and magnetism to reverse my obesity. So I told my family one day on Thanksgiving, which is a holiday here in the States, that I was going to change my life by changing my environment, especially my light environment, by utilizing these two protocols that I had come up with. And nobody believed me. Everybody laughed at me. And my brother-in-law specifically was standing there. And I said, in a year from now, I will be in jeans that are smaller than your waist. And at the time, his waist was 36, which is an American size. At the time, my waist was 48. The only person that didn't laugh was my wife. And in 3 months, I lost 77 pounds. 11 months, I lost 133 pounds. It's now been a decade. And I've had a stable weight since that time, while never paying attention to what the doctors tell you, that you need to eat less and exercise more. In fact, what I do is I eat more and I exercise less because I understand fundamentally how quantum mechanics controls everything in a mitochondria. And my goal then became, once it worked on me, the next person I did a biohack on was my son. It worked for him. Then I did it to my nephew. And then the next thing happened is all my patients were like, Doc, are you sick? Is there something wrong? How did you do this fast? And the doctors in my hospital started asking me the same thing. And then something miraculous happened. A couple of the gastroenterology doctors, the GI doctors who deal with guts, had very difficult cases. And they started to send it to me. And that neurosurgeons classically deal with the brain and the spine. They don't deal with the gut at all, at least in the United States. And when they sent me these cases, the people got better and they were stunned. And I was applying the same things that I used on obesity. And the reason I knew it was going to work, because fundamentally I knew that I was altering my mitochondrial function. And basically everything that comes down to biophysics comes down to how your mitochondria fundamentally are able to decipher the environmental signals that they get in order to make sense of what to do with electrons and protons. And then when this happened long enough, one of the GI doctors, his name was Don Lazis, he said to me, Jack, this is amazing. We can't wait for your book to come out. You need to start putting this information on the web. So that's what I did. That's how the blog was started. And it wasn't my actually idea. It was actually one of my consultant doctors that suggested that I start. And now you fast forward 5 years, you've probably got enough blog input that would probably take you a full year to read and probably take you maybe a decade to truly understand. And that's probably the reason why, podcasts and videos like this are important to people, because I can cut through a lot of the really difficult science to really make the key points that you need to understand. And then if you decide you want to really understand the science, all you have to do is go back and read a blog and say, there it is. And there's all the sites with it. You know, now people are a little bit more fortunate because 5 years ago, most of the books that are present and published today weren't published then. So you had to photocopy all these papers and it would cost you a fortune. Today, you can go out and buy 5 or 6 books and all the data is nicely correlated for you there, and you read it and it shocks you. It absolutely will shock you. And that's why I tell people, I don't think what I'm doing is amazing at all. I think I'm just an innovator that connects things that don't appear to be connected, and then I explain to you how they are connected in us so that I can explain why certain diseases happen, because many of the diseases that we have showed up at our doorstep in the 20th century have been amplified. Some of them were present even back in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, but they weren't as amplified because the circadian mismatches that we've allowed as a species have gotten much greater since Tesla and Westinghouse electrified the world. That began in the World's Fair in 1883 in Chicago. And since that time, things have rapidly sped up.
Okay, so the only time that you've actually gained weight after that first change that you made was a biohack that you just recently did. I think it was last year, where you turned yourself hypoxic on purpose, and you were eating this like paleo diet that is approved by paleo leaders.
And real quick, explain what hypoxic is. Obviously, a lot of the viewers don't know. Yeah.
How did you turn yourself hypoxic?
Hypoxia is or I should say, the most important thing. Hypoxia is a simple thing to understand. It's lack of oxygen. Either you can force it on yourself, or in the world that we live in, we've now been forced to live in a pseudo-hypoxic world. For example, in Estonia, the way that you can make yourself acutely hypoxic is just go up on the top of a mountain. That's a reasonable way to think about it. Another way to do it is to hold your breath. The problem that we don't realize is that the world that we have created with non-native EMF and blue light specifically that's sitting over both of your heads is that makes your mitochondria pseudo-hypoxic. And here's where the tie comes in. What is special about human mitochondria? It comes from a bacteria. And bacteria can use all kinds of things as terminal electron acceptors, but our mitochondria can only use one thing, and that thing is oxygen. So anytime someone is pseudo-hypoxic or hypoxic, it has tremendous effects on what happens on electron chain transport before it. And that's the reason why it becomes important.
So, yeah, what were the, did you get your answer, by the way?
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you how exactly you made yourself hypoxic.
Yeah, what was the hack that you tried, and how did you make yourself hypoxic?
Yeah, they sell masks over here where you can make yourself hypoxic.
Oh, the training mask?
Yeah, training mask that guys use for training, like if they're getting ready to climb Kilimanjaro or they're getting ready to climb Everest. These things are readily available on the internet. They're very simple to do. And my idea was to prove to people that the paleo diet is constructed by the food gurus here in the United States wasn't really the be-all, end-all they were, because the whole point of the leptin prescription and the cold thermogenesis protocol were to show you, fundamentally, the biophysics that control mitochondria. And that's the key. See, what people don't understand, especially when they're in biology, the guys who are the leaders of the paleo diet are predominantly biologic-based, biochemists by nature. One of them is a organic chemist at Harvard, and I went to one of their conferences in, I guess it was 2011, and I asked one of their leaders specifically about the effect of electrons, and he couldn't not answer the question, and I was stunned. That's when I realized that the people who should have this science down really well did not. And that's the reason I did the biohack last year, is to take their diet that they espouse and cause me to gain weight just by changing my oxygen tensions and changing the light environment that I allowed. The other question that you asked me is, how else did I do it with a mask? Just by having blue light makes you hypoxic. Why? When you're in a blue light environment, your mitochondria swell. When your mitochondria swell, every 1 angstrom that it increases reduces quantum tunneling of electrons by a factor of 10, okay? Now, why is that important for your listeners to understand? Because every single thing that they put in their mouth in Estonia is broken down into electrons. And that's what gets fed through on electron chain transport. So I realized with this biohack, I could show the skeptics of the world, and trust me, there's a lot of them out there, that diet is not the be-all end-all. Anyone who thinks that changing their food alone is going to reverse a significant epigenetic disease needs to be schooled on biophysics.
So let's go a little bit simpler, because a lot of people, at least a lot of our listeners here in Estonia, there's basically everyone who's trying to lose weight thinks that it's a diet thing. You mentioned blue light, so can you explain the blue light thing a little bit? What is blue light, and where do we get the non-native blue light and everything? What's the blue light topic?
Well, the blue light thing is actually, I think, pretty simple, but it's actually a new concept for most people in biology. We look at, you have to look at surfaces. When I say surfaces, the eye is one, the retina is one surface, the skin is another, the gut is another, and then the lung surface is another. So there's 4 total. Within the skin, I throw in the circulatory system because of how it works. And that becomes really important for certain diseases, especially like autoimmune conditions. But most people in the States look at the eye as a camera for vision. They don't realize that it's the ultimate clock. It's the circadian clock that controls how we handle electrons and protons on our mitochondria. When you begin to understand that, the gears of that clock are altered and affected by the other surfaces, but in different ways, in ways that many people don't appreciate because they don't understand light at its most fundamental level. And light at its most fundamental level is the photoelectric effect. And most people have heard of that because Einstein won a Nobel Prize for it. But what blue light fundamentally does, it creates reactive oxygen species to a much greater degree inside a cell. In normal sunlight, the way we talk about blue light is normal sunlight has a balanced blue spectrum. What does that mean? It means the amount of blue is completely balanced by the amount of red that's in it. And we have a term in physics called color temperature. So in sunlight, the color temperature of blue is on a 1-to-1 relationship with red. So blue stimulates us in the morning to wake up, but red always controls that stimulus. When you live in an environment which you guys are in right now, those lights above you that are in the reflections behind you, they have 4 times the amount of blue compared to sunlight. They contain no red and they have no UV. So what have you effectively done in the modern world? Because all of us are now using LED bulbs and fluorescent bulbs. We now live in an alien sun environment, okay? There is absolutely no way around this ubiquitous effect because most people now live indoors. They don't live outside. The ophthalmologists and dermatologists, at least in my country, are telling people to be afraid of the sun, which is ridiculous. The story should be, you should be afraid of the indoor light environment that we've created. And the reason that we've done this is because the designers of lights, they look at the superficial vanity levels. They don't look at the biologic effects that are tied to this and how it ruins our eye clock. And the reason why this is important, literally, we just found out about how the eye clock works in the year 2000. A guy named George Brainerd found a new photoreceptor in the retina called melanopsin. And melanopsin works on 435 to 465 nanometer wavelength light, which is directly in the blue spectrum. If you go on the internet after this podcast and look at the spectrum of an LED bulb or look at the spectrum of a fluorescent bulb that's over your guys' head now, you'll see that it has a huge blue color spike in that realm. So what does that fundamentally do? It ruins melanopsin signaling in the eye. Melanopsin goes through the central retinal pathways into your brain to control growth and metabolism. You know what that's a synonym for? Screwing your mitochondria. That's directly how you ruin control of electrons and protons from food. And if you don't know that's going on, changing to a paleo diet is like pissing in the wind. I don't know how you say that in Estonia, but in the United States it makes good sense.
Yeah, well, luckily we actually know a little bit about that blue light and the problems. That's why I'm wearing those glasses. They are called blue techs. They look like usual glasses, but actually they are blocking blue.
You're wearing orange.
I think it's time now to bring out the real things.
The douchebag glasses.
Yeah,
I don't care.
These glasses that I have too are blue techs, but they also have BPI tints on them, so they completely block almost most. I wouldn't say all, but they block UVA, some frequencies, and they block blue. The reason I put them on before we started, because you can see I put the blue light behind me because you guys couldn't see me too well on Skype. It would be my choice to actually just turn the lights off and talk in the dark because it's better for us. And that may not bode well for probably your video crew and people listening to the podcast, because they may want, to have some kind of visual input on this. So I think it's reasonable to put them on, but they have to realize the single most important thing in my view to getting well is protecting your eye clock. And the reason why is your eye clock has some very fancy physics in it that use specific light frequencies to regenerate at different times. And what people don't understand is that in your eye is where dopamine, melatonin, serotonin, and melanin are all generated. These are all what we call biogenic amines, and they are created from UV light and from aromatic amino acids in our body. And most people know, I think in the wellness community, that melatonin and sleep is regenerative. The problem is they believe that it's a sleep or pineal story. And that's not where the story begins, my friend. That's about the third or fourth floor of the story. The basement, it's right here in the eye.
Ocular melatonin.
And that's where it begins.
So I probably should put mine on also. See, mine look like a construction worker's glasses. So I look like a blue color stud.
Yeah, but that's okay because I have those glasses myself, and
that's good.
When I have my other blue tech lenses on, I actually have those glasses and go right over mine. I don't have those here. They're in my other house in Mississippi. I'm down here on Bourbon Street in New Orleans right now. So these come with me anytime, I'm going to be in blue light, or if I go out, like tonight, my wife is coming in town and we'll be going out to dinner. These will be on my eyes.
So let's talk about a little bit about the glasses. Mine cost like, I don't know, $8 to $10, and I got them from Amazon.com. You said that not just the house lighting, basically what we have here also, that it emits 4 times as much blue light as the sun does. But if we put these on, then does it block all the blue light, or what do they actually do? Yeah, all the blue light?
Yeah, it does. And see, that's the key thing with it. But here's the point that I'd like to make to you and Jano. Take a look at your environment. Look at your skin, how much skin's exposed. We haven't talked about the other surface.
Yeah.
And see, that other surface is a big deal. Then we've got the gut to realize, and then how the lung fits into this. And see, this is the problem with the wellness paradigm. They don't understand. They want it simple. And the reason people want it simple, I hate to tell you, is because they don't think well. And the reason they don't think well is because they live in an alien world that's filled with non-native EMF and blue light that lowers your dopamine level. What people don't understand about the brain, this is what neurosurgery understands very well. When you have a low dopamine state, it opens you up to many problems.
Parkinson's, for example.
Neurosurgery and neurology specifically, you can't see trends well. If you can't see trends, you lose creativity. And the other thing is you become a poor thinker, and you begin to be fascinated by things like Twitter because you have a memory of a flea. People do not want to sit down and read books anymore. They want to get all their information about politics, about life in general and biology from a tweet that's 140 characters. That's not going to cut it.
Is it connected to depression also?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Low dopamine state. Look, dopamine raises the electric potential on an EEG. What do we know about everybody who's depressed? They have low amounts of DHA in their brain. They have low dopamine state, and their EEG voltages are low. I mean, that's not even, the link there is so obvious, but it's amazing to me how psychiatrists and doctors instead will pull their prescription pad out and write for chemicals that have fluoride in it that lead to dehydration. And anytime you're dehydrated, you're creating a bigger problem inside the cell, because basically what you're doing is you're reducing the amount of energy that we can store. And where does that energy ultimately come for both plants and animals? It comes from the sun. And that's the key. And the key is we don't understand how all these things link together to lead to so many different changes in us. And just blue light alone can alter your mitochondrial DNA haplotypes. Almost everybody in the world knows about 23andMe, but what they don't really know is if you look at where your haplotype is from,
I think they went bust. I think they went bust. They closed down, I think. Yeah.
But most people in the world don't come these days from Africa. I mean, we all came from there. But when we left Africa as a species, all of our haplotypes changed. And that tells you that mitochondria, the bacteria that we stole at endosymbiosis, responds to the environment that it's in. That should be the hugest clue to everybody in biology that what we really believe about disease is so far off base it's not even funny. And there's a researcher out there right now that we talked about before we went live. His name is Douglas Wallace. You guys need to look at his YouTube videos and carefully listen to some of the things that he talks about, because he explains that if you look at the world's population right now from an equatorial latitude perspective, most people live outside the tropics in the world today. That's even a bigger problem when you add in the non-native EMF effect and the blue light effect. Why? Because people who live in an equatorial area have a very strong mitochondrial coupling. In other words, they can eat less food to get the same amount of work because their mitochondria and the nucleus are completely working in unison. It's like a Ferrari engine. The reason it can do what it does, its gears are tightly coupled from motor to transmission. It's no different. You guys, where you live, have mitochondrial haplotypes that allow you to live in colder environments. The reason you have that is because you have to eat more food to make more heat, okay? And heat is a form of light. That light allows you to take protons and uncouple them to make more warmth so that you can live at the environment you do. What is the offset to that? The offset to that is if you change other things in your environment, you're opening yourself up to other diseases. So I'm not going to pick on Jano here, but I'm going to pick on him a little bit because he's got a disease that is linked to this very topic. See, long time ago when Jano and I talked and we did a consult, he struggled to understand why MS, there was cases a long time ago in the 16s and 1700s that we knew about when non-native EMF wasn't around. This is what Jano's forgotten. What's the #1 mismatch for multiple sclerosis? Not only is it the eye, but it's also on the skin. And here's where it gets interesting. What do modern humans do? I want you both to take a look at yourself right now. Did you come out of your mama with clothes on? No. And so you're not designed to be there. 700,000 years ago, humans began to wear clothes. That was the first circadian mismatch. Then we started to use fire at night. Even red light at night, infrared light, can destroy melatonin. That is the major antioxidant in the brain that works with aquaporin 4 gates that are in our brain that shuttle water back and forth. Here's the interesting part about aquaporin 4 gates that are linked to MS. Do you know that in the water channel of the aquaporphyrin gate, there's 4 nitrogen atoms? And this is where Jano should pay deep attention, because the same 4 nitrogen atoms happen to be in chlorophyll and happen to be in hemoglobin. And what do? They interact with light frequencies to do the things in those cells that allow us to do. Well, the same thing happens in the aquaporphyrin gate. And when you're blue light toxic, you let too much water through those channels to stretch the space between neurons and glial cells. And how do we see that as clinicians? We get MRIs and we see white matter plaques. And that tells us in focal areas, that's where the problem lies. And where does that fundamentally come from? It comes from too much blue light through the skin, too much blue light through the eye, too much blue light through the gut, and too much blue light through the lung surface. Ultimately, it manifests in your brain. Why? Why does it happen there? The only way you're going to understand this is to understand what Doug Wallace says in these videos, that when you change your haplotype of mitochondria, it amplifies the disease in focal areas. That's how the phenotype is changed in a disease. It also explains why MS and why other neurodegenerative disorders manifest so differently, yet the mechanism behind all of them are always the same. And that's the key. That's the key point that people don't understand. Why? Because they don't understand light, water, and magnetism and how they work together. And when you want to understand this, you do have to do some deep science. But I have a pretty famous saying on my site with my members that I'll share with you guys, and I'm sure Jan already knows it. You don't have to speak, Mandarin Chinese to like Chinese food. If you really want to know how to help yourself best, it's pretty simple. Eat like a great white shark and live like a polar bear. And if you want to add on to that, be like the Sphinx. See this morning sunrise every morning and make sure your body is completely connected to the ground below, because that's how you generate the circuit. The key thing for guys like Jano with his disease, and we just mentioned this right before we came on air, that there's going to be some times when we put Jano in an equatorial environment, like in Hawaii, and it's going to overheat his cycle. Why? I explained to you earlier that he's designed to be loosely coupled, not tightly coupled. So that means that's like putting too much electricity through his circuits. It's no different than what happens in a house. When you overload a circuit that's designed to be loosely coupled, what do you think happens? So how can you overcome that? Well, you can overcome that by understanding the biology or the biophysics of the disease. He needs to up the amount of DHA, limit the blue light. If he's going to live in Estonia, which is perfectly fine, he probably needs to be at a higher elevation where, even in Estonia right now, he could actually get UV light. Why? Because when you get over 5,000 feet, you're able to get UVB light even at a high latitude. How do you like that, Jano?
Well, he'd like it, but we don't have anything higher than 300 meters here. And that's measured from sea level, so he's pretty much screwed.
I can move.
Yeah. No.
I'm thinking.
See, all these little details, they start to manifest when you think about them. And the point that I'm trying to make to you guys is that the environment controls how your mitochondrial DNA works for you to handle the environments that you live in. And this is the part that's the big missing piece. Everything about a mitochondria is fundamental at a quantum level. And unfortunately, there's very few people in biology that are talking about this level. Everybody wants to talk about, diet, exercise, and supplements of how to continue to live your bad life and take shit that's not going to help you get better. Until you take control of your light environment, most of those things are not going to help. All they're going to do is enrich a paradigm or an entrepreneur to something else. Now, can they help you if you start to get the big things right, like light? Then I'm going to tell you there is a role for certain, different supplements and different things like that. But if you think, you're going to get in a CrossFit gym and work on blue light all day and you can just take some supplements and you're going to be okay, that's a prescription for a disaster coming down the pike.
Let's get practical about light. what's your advice that people should do? Obviously, they should not switch on the lights in the evening when it gets dark outside. What's the main advice you can give to people about just getting light right?
Well, the key thing with light is very simple. You need to get UV and IR during the day. And remember how UV and IR light work. Where you guys are right now, you're in vitamin D winter. And that's not really as important. That's probably the one part that the ancestral group has got down pretty good. They understand that vitamin D is important. But where you guys are, you're in a vitamin D winter for a really, really long time. And what people don't understand is that the UVA spectrum, even in January in Estonia, is still there. But where it shows up has to do with the latitude that you're on and the time of day. So, for example, here in New Orleans, I'm at the 29th latitude. 29th latitude, we start making UVA light probably right around 9 o'clock. Where you guys are, I'm not sure what your latitude is, but it's going to be later. It's going to be probably like maybe 11 o'clock. And the reason for that, the way UV light works on Earth is that it has to do with the angle of inclination of the sun's rays through the ionosphere. So the higher latitude you are, the shorter the window is that you'll get UV. But the reason why the sun is important in the morning, because as soon as the sunlight hits us in the morning, it always has equal parts of blue, green, and red. And that's the key part that people are missing. When they go in fake light, they're getting 4 times the amount of blue, no red, no UV. Okay? Sometimes they're not even getting any green in those fake lights. That also leads to problems, especially like blood diseases like multiple myeloma, leukemia, things like that. It's been well documented in the research, but the problem is that research is not getting to clinical medicine. It's clearly not getting to you guys in your country because no one's making these fundamental leaks. And the funny part is I told you, your neighbor next door in Russia has done amazing work on UV light. In fact, I just did a show with one of my co-inventors of a device that I came up called the Quantlet, where we talked about a GDV camera. It was made by a Russian scientist who runs the Russian Olympic team. And you guys may be interested to hear this. They were utilizing UV and IR light to blood dope their athletes. No one could test it. And they dominated at the Sochi Games. And the interesting thing is, how did they measure how much photochemical change their athletes got? In other words, how did they know that they put enough energy in and didn't put too much in to blow the circuits? They used this camera, and this camera actually took pictures of the amount of energy around their body. A lot of people here in the States think this is woo, but the interesting thing is this camera correlates with nuclear magnetic resonance imaging of cell water in their body. And see, that's what people don't know about water. See, there's many different ways for us to measure these effects. And this guy happens to use this GDV camera. And it measures the amount of energy that's carried within the atomic lattice of these athletes. Part of the reason why I found this very interesting is because Ruben was interested in this guy's work, but he could never explain it as a GE light engineer. And I have this saying on my site that everything is woo unless you can explain it. And see, I can explain it. And that's the key. The key is when you fundamentally understand how light works, you begin to have a deep, deep appreciation for why changing our light environment is the single biggest cause for most of the disease. There's others. Non-native EMF and bidirectional microwave devices that we call cell phones are another one. This computer that we're on is another one. I think those are easier to mitigate because people are beginning to understand how to ground their electronics. The problem is there's no way to properly ground an altered light spectrum through your eye or your skin until you understand the details of how your atomic lattice is designed to work photoelectrically and photochemically.
Is it possible to buy that camera from somewhere?
The GDV camera,
Yeah.
sure. You can buy it. You can buy it on Amazon. Not only that, Jano, you have the opportunity to just contact Ruben and say, hey, Ruben bought it at a biophysics conference in Europe. And actually, believe it or not, you're a member on my site, so you would know. And we did a webinar where we were out on my porch here in Bourbon Street in the middle of a storm, and me and Ruben did a biohack utilizing this camera to show that during an electrical storm, energies that we could absorb from the environment would be altered. And it worked. That's part of the reason why people feel worse in places like Seattle or maybe like Estonia now, because, you know, it's in the middle of the winter. But, you know, when people say that, they have the observational experience of living it, but science doesn't have a way to explain why this happens. They know it happens, but they don't have a way to study it. And the reason they don't is because they don't understand how light really works with biology, because it's all biophysical.
What are some other tests that we could run to assess the health of our mitochondria?
Well, you could use EEGs. That's a more expensive and a more difficult way of doing it. But again, that is one way. If you wanted to use blood testing, I've written a blog post called the Redox Prescription. I go through 30 different tests there and explain via each one what it physically tells you. One of the easiest ones for people to use, especially for dehydration, is to look at your BUN and creatinine ratio. I don't know if they have the same test in Estonia. That's something that you guys maybe could do in your show notes for people over there. But BUN creatinine ratio is a measure of dehydration. It usually links directly to what we call a hemoglobin hematocrit, which is pretty much standard across the world. What we're looking for there is to see if someone's anemic. And why is anemia always associated with an altered light environment? Well, this is pretty simple. What are the two major proteins that are in red blood cells? Porphyrins and hemoglobin. Everybody seems to know about hemoglobin because you guys asked me about it earlier. You know that that is the protein that carries oxygen to mitochondria in the body so that we can deliver electrons to it to make O2. The other thing they don't know about hemoglobin is hemoglobin absorbs 270 nanometer light, and then it absorbs 3 frequencies in the red. That's the reason why blood is red. It has a very strong cutoff at 600 nanometers. So that means red light above 600, there's no absorption. The key thing that doctors have to begin to realize, and so do patients, is red blood cells in the hemoglobin spectrum absorb 270 nanometer light. Turns out Gerald Pollack, who's a pretty smart guy about water, also found out that this exclusion zone in water, and remember, blood is 93% water, also refracts light at 270 nanometers. So it begins to start to make sense why hemoglobin absorbs at 270 nanometers. The second protein that you guys need to learn about is porphyrins. And porphyrins are one of the things that we talked about earlier. That's what chloroplast, and that's what hemoglobin effectively is. It's a porphyrin molecule. All porphyrin molecules have 4 nitrogens. So that means the aquaporphyrin gate that controls water flows in the brain that are affected in MS also have a porphyrin-like effect. All porphyrins absorb all frequencies of UV light. So just so we're clear, the normal solar spectrum invisible light in the UV range goes from 260 all the way up to 400. So guess what? Your body has a built-in collection system. When sunlight hits our skin, there is a chemical called nitric oxide. And this is where we get into the part of the story that interests Jano so much. Why does Terry Walls, who has MS, get part of the story about MS correct? She tells people to eat leafy vegetables and lots of different colors. The reason why? Those foodstuffs have nitrogen in them. That nitrogen makes nitric oxide. When sun hits your skin, nitric oxide vasodilates blood vessels so they come closer to the surface. Why is that important? Because UVB sunlight only penetrates the skin 0.1 millimeters, which means the skin doesn't absorb very much UV light, so the blood vessels have to come to the surface to absorb those frequencies in the UV spectrum. And that's what makes the skin very important. And it works with light. So if you have your body completely covered by clothes, even if you live at a high altitude and a high latitude, there's much more likelihood that you're going to be UV deficient and wind up with a disease like MS, or wind up with an anaplastic astrocytoma, or wind up with a higher likelihood of having Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's. The same effect is beginning to happen in the United States at lower latitudes. But the interesting effect for everybody to look at is not only is autoimmune conditions much higher away from the equator, so is cancer. And the reason for this gets back to what we were talking about earlier, how the haplotype in mitochondria fundamentally work. And since we've changed our environment as a species, since 1893 with Tesla and Westinghouse's use of the AC current, it's even worse. And the reason why this is another assault to these haplotype changes in mitochondria, and that means we get, when we don't understand these fundamentals, we get the belief that eating a paleo diet that has a little bit more DHA than a standard Western diet is somehow better. The problem is you don't understand the biophysics of why it's better, because DHA fundamentally allows you to turn light into a DC electric current. The DC electric current is actually what regenerates cells.
And the most DHA we have in seafood, in fish, right?
Yeah, well, and it tends to be, DHA tends to be highest in what we call pelagic fishes. Those are fishes where you guys are, in cold water. And the colder the water is, the more DHA is in there. And it turns out in humans, specifically us, and really this is all mammals, but we're a specialized brand of eukaryotes. We concentrate all ours in the central and peripheral nervous system. And see, then you're in my realm. And here's the interesting thing for Jano and you to understand. You may not know this. Do you know where the highest concentration of DHA is in the mammalian brain? Right here in the eye. And the RPE of the eye that runs that eye clock program. And now you begin to see full circle how this story ties together between light, water, and magnetism.
And blue light destroys DHA, right?
Excuse me?
Blue light, it destroys DHA, right?
Correct.
So,
blue light
this is the reason why MS, usually people with MS start to complain about their vision. Is that true?
Right. It's the number one, you know it. It's the number one symptom in MS. Now you know why. And here's the other thing that you need to look at. I'll give you another name for you to understand this effect. Blue light also causes something called the blue light hazard or visual blur. The more blue light you get, the more chance you get myopic. The more chance that you also have problems seeing details. That's why it's one of the first signs in MS cases that the eye starts to go bad. And people don't understand why that's the case. And the reason why, because everybody that has MS is blue light toxic by definition. And if you think minding your mitochondria and eating leafy vegetables is going to solve that problem, you're dead wrong. That's a half truth that will lead to a full lie. And I've told Jano this because I do respect Terry Walls a lot. She's the first doctor that really has got into this and got part of the equation down. But the part she's missing is the non-native EMF and the blue light. And that's what I want Jano to get right. Why? Because I think Jano can change the world more than someone like Terry Walls can, because he fundamentally understands more of how the eye and the skin work together to control the aquaporin 4 gate in his brain.
Should people worry about mercury in fish?
What? Mercury in fish?
Yeah.
That's a very complicated talk. My standard answer is no, okay? But here's where it does get interesting. If, and you guys have to pay attention to this because your next door neighbor, Russia, has done some pretty bad shit to the seafood supply up in your neck of the woods.
Baltic Sea, yeah.
And if you do get tested and you do have mercury, in my opinion, the way the anti-aging doctors in the States and Canada test is not accurate. You need to use mass spectroscopy of your skin or your eye. And we do have that. Excuse me. We do have that in the United States, but it's only in research facilities. I will tell you my own advice. For 10 years, I've been eating tons of seafood to get myself well. I don't have this issue. And if I did, I should have the problem, and I don't. But if you happen to be a person that's got really bad teeth and you've got a lot of amalgam fillings, and then you let the dentist take them out, that's when I'm worried about people. Because when you put a drill to those teeth and take the metal out, you vaporize the mercury, and mercury is fat toxic. Why is this important? Goes into the dermis of your skin where those blood vessels are. So anytime light hits your skin, and specifically blue light, here's what you guys need to understand, because it's where it gets a little detailed. UVB light only penetrates the skin 0.1 millimeters. UVA light goes right into the dermis level. But blue light goes to where the mercury is, and blue light, how is it made, at least in the States, and I'm sure it's made where you guys are? We use mercury filaments in fluorescent bulbs and in LED bulbs to create white light. What does that mean? It means that the way the light was created in the bulb can interact with mercury in your skin, and it can make MS cases far worse if that's the case. And unfortunately, biologic dentists here in the United States do not understand this physics, and it's completely tied to how light works. That's why with my members, I always counsel them about this. If you go on my blogs, especially the blog comments, I talk about mercury resonance frequency interactions. If your members are interested in learning more about this channel, I would tell them to look up a guy in Germany. His name is Alexander Wunsch, and you spell his last name Wunsch. He is a physician, an MD, but he's an expert in artificial light. He's probably the best expert that I know of in Europe. I would tell you it'd be probably smart for you guys to do a podcast with him to talk about this mercury effect, because it's huge. And I do believe if you are mercury toxic, you need to be very, very careful about making a decision to take your amalgams out. I tell my patients not to do it for this reason, because we now live in a non-native EMF blue world, and that means that removing them and making mercury more volatile is more dangerous than just leaving it alone. There is another caveat to this, though, and this is not a caveat that you're going to like to hear, Jano. I posted yesterday on my doctor Facebook page that there is now proof, or I shouldn't say proof, but data that suggests that utilizing MRIs when you have amalgams in your teeth can actually vaporize some of the mercury so that you absorb it. So, you know, in a disease like MS, that's a big deal, because we order a lot of MRIs in people with MS. Mm-hmm. So if you have amalgams there, it becomes important to make the consideration, should I remove this? And if you do remove it, you need to mandate to the biologic dentist that it has to be done under red light and not blue. Because if you absorb any of that mercury, it could have devastating consequences for your MS flares. It's also now one of the things that I look for in MS patients after they have MRIs, whether they get flare-ups of their disease. And if they do, this is something that I usually will mention to the neurologist, or at least to the patient, so they know. And as you know, Jano, I used to be a dentist, so I know a lot about teeth, okay? Mm-hmm. I used to be an oral surgeon before I was a neurosurgeon. So this is not like an uneducated opinion that I'm giving you here. This is based on very, very new science that's not very well known. And because it's not very well known, most people will tell you that it's woo. And remember what I told you before about my rule about woo. If you can explain it, it's not woo. And I just explained to you exactly how it happens.